Margaret Rose Bennett had been dead to the music world for 54 years. But on a cold Tuesday morning in November 2023, she walked into a London recording studio carrying a yellowed piece of paper that would change everything. The song written on it was composed when she was just 17 years old. She had never sung it for another living soul. What happened next would break the internet, move millions to tears, and prove that dreams don't have expiration dates. But to understand why Margaret's story became a global phenomenon, we need to go back to where it all began. In a small council flat in Manchester, 1968, where a teenage girl with an extraordinary voice was about to make the hardest decision of her life. Margaret was 17 when she wrote Dancing in the Rain. It was July 1968, and the whole world seemed to be changing. The Beatles were at their peak. Young people were protesting in the streets of Paris, and Margaret Rose Bennett was falling in love for the first time. His name was Tommy Harrison, and he had the most beautiful brown eyes she'd ever seen. I remember sitting by my bedroom window, Margaret would later recall, her voice still carrying traces of her Manchester accent even decades later. Tommy had just told me he was being shipped off to Vietnam with the American forces. His family had moved to the States when he was 15. I was heartbroken, but there was something about that summer rain falling outside my window that made me feel like maybe love could survive anything. She picked up her guitar, a cheap acoustic her mother had bought her for her 16th birthday, and the melody came to her like it had been waiting her whole life to be found. The lyrics flowed out in one sitting. We were dancing in the rain that summer night, never knowing it might be our last goodbye. But I'll keep dancing, keep believing that love finds a way to shine through even when the storm clouds hide the light. It was beautiful. It was raw. It was the kind of song that could have launched 1,000 careers. Margaret knew it was special. Her best friend Sarah knew it was special. Even her usually critical mother stopped washing dishes when she heard Margaret humming it in the kitchen. But 1968 was a different world for young women. Margaret's parents, William and Dorothy Bennett, had married young and struggled their entire lives. Her father worked double shifts at the textile mill, coming home with fingers stained permanent blue from the dyes. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in the better parts of Manchester, scrubbing floors until her knees bled through her stockings. Music is a lovely hobby, love, her mother would say, not unkindly, but with the weariness of someone who had learned that dreams were luxuries poor families couldn't afford. But you need something steady, something real. The pressure wasn't just from her parents. In 1968, the music industry was overwhelmingly male-dominated. Female artists were expected to be pretty, polished, and manageable. Margaret was beautiful in an unconventional way. Tall, with wild curly red hair and freckles that covered her face like scattered stars. But she wasn't polished. She was raw, emotional, real in a way that made record executives uncomfortable. She auditioned for 3 different record labels that summer. Each time, she sang Dancing in the Rain with everything she had. Each time, she was rejected. "You've got a nice voice, dear," one executive told her, barely looking up from his paperwork. "But this song is too personal, too melancholy. People want happy music, upbeat, something they can dance to in the clubs." Another suggested she try writing jingles for advertisements instead. "There's good money in commercial work," he said with a condescending smile. "Music that sells soap and cigarettes. That's where a girl with your background might find success." By August, Tommy had shipped out to Southeast Asia. Margaret received 2 letters from him, both talking about how much he missed her, how he kept thinking about that night they danced in the rain outside the youth center. The 3rd letter never came. In September, Margaret learned Tommy had been killed in action near Da Nang. He was 19 years old. The news broke something in Margaret that she didn't know how to fix. She stopped playing guitar. She stopped writing songs. Dancing in the Rain was folded carefully and placed in a shoebox under her bed, along with Tommy's letters and a photograph of them together at the summer fair. Margaret's mother found her crying in her room 3 days after the news came. "I know it hurts, love," Dorothy said, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed. "But this is why I tell you music is enough. Men leave. Dreams disappoint. You need something you can count on." A week later, Margaret enrolled in secretarial school. She met James Bennett in 1971 when she was working as a secretary at a law firm in Manchester City Centre. He was 26, a junior accountant with kind eyes and steady hands. He wasn't Tommy. No one could be Tommy, but he was good and reliable, and he made her laugh. When he proposed in 1973, Margaret said yes because it felt like the practical thing to do. Their wedding was small and lovely. Margaret wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her taller frame. At the reception, James's uncle played piano and asked if anyone wanted to sing. For just a moment, Margaret felt a familiar pull in her chest, the urge to open her mouth and let music pour out. But she shook her head and smiled politely. "I don't really sing anymore," she said. The words felt like a small death. James was a good husband. Margaret wants everyone to know that, even now, he worked hard, never raised his voice, brought her flowers every Friday for 47 years. They had 2 children, David in 1975 and Emma in 1978. Margaret threw herself into motherhood with the same passion she had once reserved for music. She volunteered at the school, organized bake sales, drove countless carpools, and never missed a single football match or school play. But late at night, when the house was quiet and James was sleeping beside her, Margaret would sometimes find herself humming "Dancing in the Rain" under her breath. The melody was as clear as ever, even after decades of silence. Her children grew up knowing their mother had played guitar back in the day, but they never heard her sing. Not really. Sometimes, when she was doing dishes or folding laundry, she would hum softly to herself. But if anyone walked into the room, she would stop immediately, as if caught doing something embarrassing. Mum was always very private about her music. Her daughter Emma would later tell a BBC interviewer, "We found her old guitar in the attic when I was about 12, and when I asked her to play something, she just smiled and said those days were behind her. I wish I had pushed harder. I wish I had known what we were missing." The years passed in the blur of ordinary moments. David became a teacher. Emma became a nurse. They gave Margaret 4 grandchildren who called her Nana and loved her fierce hugs and her chocolate chip biscuits. James retired from the accounting firm with a modest pension. They bought a small cottage in the Cotswolds and spent their golden years gardening and taking walking holidays. Margaret's old shoebox moved with them through every house, every relocation. Sometimes she would open it and look at the yellowed piece of paper with "Dancing in the Rain" written in her teenage handwriting. The ink had faded, but every word, every note was still burned into her memory. She never played it. Not once. In 2019, James was diagnosed with early-stage dementia. It progressed slowly at first. Forgotten names, misplaced keys, moments of confusion that could be laughed off. But by 2022, the man Margaret had shared her life with for nearly 50 years was disappearing a little more each day. There were good days and bad days. On good days, James remembered her name, remembered their children, could still tend his roses in the back garden. On bad days, he would look at her like she was a stranger and ask when his wife was coming home. The worst part wasn't his confusion. The worst part was the music. In his illness, James had started humming constantly, old songs from their youth, hymns from church, fragments of melodies that seemed to come from nowhere. The doctor said it was common. Music lived in a different part of the brain, often surviving long after other memories had faded. "He hums more than he talks now," Margaret told her daughter during one of their weekly phone calls. "Yesterday, he was humming something that sounded almost like a song I used to know." It wasn't quite "Dancing in the Rain," but it was close enough to break her heart all over again. James died on a Tuesday in March 2023, in his sleep, with Margaret holding his hand. The funeral was beautiful and sad and filled with people whose lives he had touched. Margaret accepted condolences and casseroles with equal grace, the way she had learned to accept everything life handed her, quietly, without complaint. But in the weeks that followed, the cottage felt impossibly quiet. For the first time in 50 years, Margaret was truly alone. Her children wanted her to move closer to them, maybe into one of those nice senior communities with activities and social clubs. Margaret smiled and told them she was fine. She just needed time. But the truth was, She didn't know how to be fine. She didn't know how to be Margaret without being James's wife, without being someone's mother, without having someone to care for. She tried to fill the silence with television, with radio, with audiobooks from the library. Nothing worked. The quiet was too loud, too full of all the songs she had never sung. It was her granddaughter Chloe who changed everything. Chloe was Emma's youngest, 22 years old and fresh out of university, with a degree in music production. She had inherited Margaret's red hair and something else too, a restless creative energy that couldn't be contained. She was visiting for the weekend, helping Margaret sort through James's belongings when she found the shoebox. "Nana, what's all this?" Chloe asked, holding up the yellowed piece of paper with obvious curiosity. Margaret's first instinct was to take it away, to change the subject, to deflect the way she had been deflecting for 54 years. But something in Chloe's eyes, bright and interested and so young, made her pause. "It's just an old song I wrote," Margaret said finally, "when I was about your age." Chloe's eyes went wide. "You wrote songs?" "Nana, I had no idea. Can I see it?" Before Margaret could stop her, Chloe was unfolding the paper, reading the lyrics with growing amazement. "Nana, this is incredible. These lyrics are, God, they're beautiful. Have you ever recorded this?" Margaret shook her head. "It was just a silly thing. I was 17, thought I was in love. You know how it is." But Chloe was already humming the melody, her musician's brain filling in harmonies and arrangements that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. "You have to sing this for me," Chloe said suddenly. "Please, Nana. I need to hear how it's supposed to sound. Oh, sweetheart, I haven't sung in decades. I wouldn't even remember. Please." Chloe's voice was gentle but insistent. "Just once. For me." Margaret looked at her granddaughter's eager face and felt something crack open in her chest. Before she could stop herself, she was humming the first few bars. And then, so, quietly it was almost a whisper, she began to sing, "We were dancing in the rain that summer night, never knowing it might be our last goodbye." Her voice was different now, whether by age, deepened by decades of living and loving and losing, but it was still unmistakably hers. Still powerful, still heartbreaking. Chloe sat frozen, tears streaming down her face, as Margaret sang the entire song for the first time in 54 years. When the last note faded, they sat in silence for a long moment. "Nana," Chloe whispered finally, "that's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. It was for someone very special, someone who died in a war very far away. "Will you tell me about him?" And for the first time in 54 years, Margaret told the story. All of it. Tommy and the rain, and the rejections, and the choice she made to put her dreams in a shoebox and live a different kind of life. Chloe listened without interrupting, her young face serious and thoughtful. "You know," she said when Margaret finished, "I work a recording studio in London, just part-time, while I'm building my portfolio. But the owner is this amazing woman, Sarah Chun, and she's always looking for authentic stories, real music. Would you ever consider recording this properly?" Margaret's first instinct was to say no, to laugh it off, to explain that she was 72 years old and far too old to be chasing teenage dreams. But something in the way Chloe was looking at her, something in the way singing the song had felt after all these years, made her pause. "I don't know, love. I'm not sure anyone would want to hear an old woman singing a song from 1968. Are you kidding?" Chloe's eyes were bright with excitement. "Nana, authentic music is everything right now. Real stories, real emotions. And your voice. God, your voice is extraordinary. Age hasn't diminished it. It's made it deeper, more beautiful." That night, Margaret lay awake thinking about Tommy, about James, about all the songs that had lived inside her for 54 years without ever being born. She thought about the girl she had been at 17, so full of dreams and music and certainty that love could conquer anything. She thought about the woman she had become, practical, reliable, always putting others first. It had been a good life, a meaningful life, but had it been her life? The next morning, she called Chloe. If I did this, she said without preamble, if I actually went to this recording studio of yours, what would happen? What would we do with it? Chloe's shriek of joy was so loud Margaret had to hold the phone away from her ear. 3 weeks later, Margaret found herself standing outside Wavelength Studios in North London, clutching her old guitar case and fighting the urge to turn around and go home. Chloe stood beside her, practically vibrating with excitement. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do," Chloe said gently. "We can just go in, meet Sarah, maybe play around a bit. No pressure." Sarah Chun turned out to be a tiny woman with kind eyes and an infectious laugh. She welcomed Margaret like an old friend, showed her around the studio with obvious pride, and made her a cup of tea exactly the way she liked it. "Chloe played me a recording of you singing on her phone," Sarah said as they settled into comfortable chairs in the control room. "I hope you don't mind. She was just so excited. But Margaret, I have to tell you, I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've rarely heard anything so moving." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "It was just a phone recording. I'm sure it wasn't very good quality." "It wasn't the quality," Sarah said quietly. "It was the truth in your voice, the lived experience. That's something you can't fake, and it's something the world needs to hear." They talked for an hour about music, about life, about the strange journey that had brought Margaret to this moment. Sarah shared her own story, how she had struggled as a young Asian woman in a predominantly white male industry, how she had almost given up her dreams multiple times before finally opening her own studio. "The music industry has changed so much since 1968, Sarah explained. "It's not perfect, nowhere near perfect, but there's more room now for authentic voices, for real stories. And with social media, with streaming platforms, age isn't the barrier it used to be. Some of the biggest viral hits of the last few years have come from unexpected places." Finally, Sarah gestured toward the recording booth. "Would you like to try singing it once, just to see how it feels?" Margaret's hands were shaking as she picked up her guitar. The booth felt impossibly large and small at the same time. Through the glass, she could see Chloe and Sarah watching her with encouraging smiles. She strummed the first chord, and 54 years fell away. Her voice cracked on the first word, but she kept going. By the second verse, the years of silence had melted away, and Margaret Rose Bennett was 17 again, singing her heart out for the boy she loved who would never come home. But she was also 72, singing for the husband who had loved her for 47 years. She was singing for her children, who had never known their mother was a songwriter. She was singing for every dream she had put aside, every song she had kept inside, every moment she had chosen security over possibility. When the last note faded, there was silence in the control room. Then Chloe started crying. Then Sarah. Then Margaret realized she was crying too. "That," Sarah said finally, her voice thick with emotion, "is what the world needs to hear." They spent the rest of the day recording, not just Dancing in the Rain, but 3 other songs that Margaret had written in those few precious months in 1968, songs she thought she had forgotten, but that came back to her like old friends. Sarah worked her magic, adding subtle arrangements that supported Margaret's voice without overwhelming it. A gentle piano melody here, soft strings there, nothing that distracted from the raw truth of the lyrics and the weathered beauty of Margaret's voice. "I want to create a video," Sarah said as they wrapped up the session. "Something simple, just you singing, maybe some old photographs if you're comfortable sharing them. The story is so powerful, Margaret. People need to hear it." Margaret hesitated. What if no one cares? What if it's just an old woman embarrassing herself? What if it's not? Chloe countered gently. What if it's exactly what someone out there needs to hear? What if your story gives someone else permission to chase their dream, no matter how old they are? Margaret thought about 17-year-old Margaret, crying in her bedroom after another rejection. She thought about that girl's dreams, how they had been carefully folded up and put away like outgrown clothes. "All right," she said finally. "Let's see what happens." The video was simple, just as Sarah had promised. Margaret sitting in her cottage living room, guitar in hand, singing Dancing in the Rain, with photographs of her younger self, of Tommy, of her family displayed on the mantelpiece behind her. The production was minimal, just Margaret's voice and guitar, with the barest hint of piano accompaniment. Sarah uploaded it to YouTube on a Tuesday morning in November 2023, exactly 55 years after Margaret first wrote the song. The title was simple. At 72, she finally sang the song she wrote as a teen. For the first hour, nothing happened. Then Sarah shared it on her social media accounts. A few of her followers watched and shared it with their friends. By evening, it had 1,000 views. By the next morning, it had 50,000. By the end of the week, it had 5 million. The comments poured in from around the world. People sharing their own stories of deferred dreams, of songs unsung, of chances not taken. Young musicians saying Margaret's voice had moved them to tears. Older viewers saying her story had inspired them to dust off instruments they hadn't touched in decades. This is what real music sounds like. One comment read, "No auto-tune, no gimmicks, just pure human emotion." Another said, "I'm 67 and always wanted to learn piano. Margaret just gave me permission to start." The media attention was overwhelming. BBC called one to do a feature story. Good Morning America reached out for an interview. Record labels that had probably never heard of Margaret Rose Bennett were suddenly interested in talking. But the moment that made Margaret cry the hardest came 3 days after the video went viral. She was sitting in her kitchen, still trying to process what was happening, when her phone rang. The voice on the other end was elderly, American, shaky with emotion. "Is this Margaret? Margaret Bennett, who wrote Dancing in the Rain?" "Yes," Margaret said slowly. "Who is this?" "My name is Robert Harrison. Tommy was my brother." Margaret's world stopped spinning. "I've been looking for you for 55 years, Robert continued, his voice breaking. "Tommy wrote me about a girl in Manchester, about a song she wrote for him. He said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. He was going to ask you to marry him when he got home." Margaret sobbed into the phone, decades of grief and love and loss pouring out of her. "I have his last letter," Robert said gently. "The one he wrote but never got to send. He talks about you, about that song, about how he hummed it every night to fall asleep. Would you like to see it?" They met the following week at a cafe in London. Robert was 81, with Tommy's same brown eyes and gentle smile. He handed Margaret an envelope yellow with age. Inside, in Tommy's familiar handwriting, were 3 pages of love and dreams and plans for a future that never came to be. "Tell her I kept dancing in the rain," the letter ended. "Tell her I never stopped believing that love finds a way to shine through." Margaret looked up at Robert through her tears. He really remembered it? All those years. He hummed it every day, according to his letters. The other soldiers called it Tommy's song. When he died, his commanding officer wrote to us and mentioned it specifically. He said Tommy was humming something beautiful right before the end. They sat together for hours, sharing memories of Tommy, of the boy who had loved music and dancing, and a red-haired girl with freckles who wrote songs that could break your heart. The viral success of Dancing in the Rain led to opportunities Margaret had never imagined. Record deals, concert offers, interview requests from around the world. But at 72, she was finally old enough to know what mattered and what didn't. She recorded an album, 10 songs, including for she had written in 1968, and 6 new ones that poured out of her in the months following Tommy's letter. She called it Dancing in the Rain, Songs from a Life Lived. She turned down most of the concert offers, but agreed to perform at a few small venues, not for the money or the fame, but for the connection, for the chance to look into audiences full of people who understood that it's never too late to chase a dream. The most meaningful performance was at a small club in Manchester, not far from where she had grown up. The audience was full of people her own age, many of them there with their children and grandchildren. When she sang Dancing in the Rain, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. "I spent 54 years thinking I had missed my chance," Margaret told the audience that night. "I thought dreams were for young people, that there was a deadline on possibility. But here's what I've learned. The song doesn't care how old you are when you finally find the courage to sing it." In the months that followed, Margaret received thousands of letters from people around the world. Many were from older adults who had been inspired to pursue long-dormant dreams. A 70-year-old woman in Australia enrolled in art school. A 68-year-old man in Texas started writing the novel he'd always talked about. A grandmother in Wales picked up the violin she hadn't touched since high school and started taking lessons with her 8-year-old grandson. But the letters that moved Margaret most were from young people. "I'm 17 and everyone tells me music isn't practical," wrote a teenager from California. "But if you could wait 55 years and still make it, maybe I don't have to give up after just a few rejections. Your story taught me that every no doesn't mean never," wrote another. "It might just mean not yet." Margaret kept every letter, the way she had once kept Tommy's letters, the way she had kept that yellowed piece of paper for 54 years. 6 months after Dancing in the Rain went viral, Margaret was invited to perform at the Royal Albert Hall as part of a charity concert for military veterans. She almost said no. The venue was enormous, intimidating, nothing like the small clubs where she had been performing. But when the organizers told her the concert was in honor of soldiers like Tommy, who had died too young in wars too far from home, she knew she had to say yes. On the night of the concert, Margaret stood in the wings listening to the murmur of 8,000 people in the audience. Her hands were shaking, her heart racing. At 73, she was about to perform on one of the most famous stages in the world. Chloe squeezed her hand. "Remember," she whispered, "you're not performing for them. You're singing for Tommy. You're singing for everyone who never got the chance to chase their dreams. You're singing for the 17-year-old girl who wrote this song and believed in love." Margaret walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. The spotlight was warm on her face as she settled onto the simple stool with her guitar. In the front row, she could see Robert Harrison, now a regular fixture at her performances, Tommy's last letter folded in his jacket pocket. "This song," Margaret said into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly to the vast hall, "was written by a 17-year-old girl who thought she knew everything about love and nothing about life. It was written for a boy who died in a war he didn't understand, fighting for ideals he believed in with his whole heart." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "I put this song away for 54 years because I thought I had missed my chance. But I've learned that love doesn't have an expiration date. Dreams don't have a deadline. Music doesn't care how old you are when you finally find the courage to let it out." The first notes rang out clear and true, and Margaret Rose Bennett began to sing. "We were dancing in the rain that summer night, never knowing it might be our last goodbye. But I'll keep dancing, keep believing that love finds a way to shine through even when the storm clouds hide the light." Her voice filled every corner of the Royal Albert Hall, carrying 55 years of love and loss, and hope deferred but never abandoned. In the audience, people were crying, singing along, holding each other close. When the last note faded, the silence stretched for a heartbeat before erupting into the longest-standing ovation in the venue's recent memory. Margaret stood on that famous stage, tears streaming down her face, finally understanding what her 17-year-old self had known, but her practical adult mind had forgotten. Some songs are so important, so true, so necessary, that they wait as long as it takes to be sung. The video of that performance has been viewed more than 100 million times. But the number that matters most to Margaret is 1. The number of times Tommy Harrison heard her sing their song in those final moments in a jungle half a world away, humming a melody that connected them across time and distance and death itself. Today, Margaret Rose Bennett lives quietly in her cottage in the Cotswolds, still writing songs, still performing occasionally, still proving to the world that it's never too late to be who you were meant to be. Her story has become legendary, but she remains humble, practical, kind, the same woman who spent 50 years making a good life even as she dreamed of a different one. On rainy days, she still sits by her window with her guitar, writing new songs and remembering old ones. Sometimes she thinks about the parallel universe where 17-year-old Margaret got the record deal, where Tommy came home from the war, where she became famous young and burned bright and fast. But mostly she's grateful for this universe, where dreams can wait patiently in shoe boxes under beds, where love survives everything including death, where a 72-year-old woman can walk into a recording studio and remind the world that the most beautiful music comes not from perfection, but from truth. The last line of Dancing in the Rain goes, "Love finds a way to shine through even when the storm clouds hide the light." Margaret Rose Bennett is living proof that some truths are so powerful, they're worth waiting a lifetime to sing.